You are listening to A Light to the Nations. This podcast is a production of the Ephesus School Network.
And it came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized of John in Jordan. And straightway coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens opened, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And there came a voice from heaven, saying, Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And immediately the Spirit driveth him into the wilderness, and he was there in the wilderness 40 days, tempted of Satan, and was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered unto him. Hello, and welcome to episode 61 of A Light to the Nations. I am your host, Father Fred Shaheen. In this episode, we continue our reading of the Gospel of Mark, covering chapter 1, verses 9 through 14. Although Mark had introduced his work as the Gospel of Jesus, calling him the Christ and the Son of God, he qualifies both of these titles, which are parallel, by the phrase, as it is written in the prophets. Mark is telling his hearers that they cannot understand Jesus as Christ/Son of God in just any old way, but exclusively according to Scripture, and specifically its second part, the prophets. And Mark uses both Isaiah and Ezekiel as his touchstones. Mark's expression that Jesus comes from Nazareth of Galilee, as well as his mention of Jordan as the location of Jesus' baptism, connects Jesus via Isaiah to the mission to the Gentiles. Let's hear the first verse of Isaiah chapter 9. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. In Isaiah, the land beyond Jordan is specified as Galilee of the nations, that is, the Gentiles. Thus, Mark connects Jesus with the mission of the servant in 2nd Isaiah, the one who will not only call back the Judahites in exile, but also the nations who are scattered abroad among them in the same wilderness. In telling us that this is where Jesus comes from, Mark is presenting him as the fulfillment through his preaching and teaching of Isaiah's servant. This will be even more apparent when Mark uses the expression elali avtis ton logon. He was preaching the word to them later in chapter 2. We had already noted that in the former prophets, the Jordan River was the line of demarcation between the wilderness and Canaan, the promised land. Mark presents Jesus as the head of the one community made up of both Israel and the Gentiles, and who, as the first act of his ministry, must pass through the water of Jordan, symbolically preceding his followers into the earth of promise. However, in the biblical story, the rest provided by Canaan proves to be temporary, as the people begin following the practices of the nations surrounding them and worshiping their gods. Their desire to be like those other nations culminates in the demand for an earthly king. And as a result of the sins committed by a series of these kings, who are called by the title Sons of God, they are cast out and sent into exile as punishment. In the Gospel of Mark, it is not Canaan on the other side of the Jordan, but rather the sea, which in scriptural terminology is the place from where the gospel must go out. See the previously quoted Isaiah chapter 9 and also the Gospel of Mark chapter 3, beginning with verse 7. We will see later how the movement of the gospel never ends. It continues on even after Jesus is being raised up from death in that his disciples are told that in order to see him, they must go to Galilee. In other words, they must start back at the place where the gospel began and rehear the message of its teaching. Chapter 1 of Mark, verse 9, concludes by telling us that Jesus is baptized by the hand of John, the one sent ahead to prepare the way, as spoken of in Isaiah. But what follows in verse 10 and 11, with Jesus seeing the heavens open and the Spirit of God descending on him, draws on another prophetic book. Let's hear the first verse of Ezekiel chapter 1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Interestingly, in Ezekiel, we get a reference directly to Elohim, that is, of the universal God, rather than Yahweh, the God of Israel. This underscores the mission in the New Testament to not only Israel, but also the nations. And the voice of God affirms that Jesus is his Son, the one who fulfills his evdokia, his good pleasure, that is to say, according to his will. But in Mark, that designation, Son of God, is problematic. Recall what we said a moment ago about the earthly kings who sinned, who were designated as sons of God. Mark is telling us that he, that is Jesus, saw the heavens opened and heard the voice of God. As hearers, we are in the know, but systematically, everyone else in the narrative, starting with Jesus' disciples, will misunderstand the meaning of this term, Son of God. Before he could be shown to be indeed the Son of God, Jesus must proceed on his mission as Son of Man, that is, as a teacher. Once again, the reference is to Ezekiel, who is addressed with the same title in the prophets. Moreover, Ezekiel is a teacher of parables, and Jesus' primary method of teaching in the Gospels is through parables. We hear the following after the parable of the mustard seed in chapter 4 of Mark. And with many such parables spake he the word unto them as they were able to hear it. But without a parable spake he not unto them. And when they were alone, kathidian, he expounded all things to his disciples. Mark 4:33 and 34. The combination of the title Son of Man with the use of parables is at its clearest in Ezekiel 17 in the introduction to the parable of the 2 eagles and a vine. Son of man, put forth a riddle and speak a parable unto the house of Israel, we hear. In the opening part of verse 9, Mark uses the expression egeneto, it came to pass, as a literary device. Rather than present a sequence of events that can be put in chronological order, this phrase is non-specific with regards to time. In other translations, it is rendered, and it happened that, or at that time. Keeping in mind that Scripture is meant to be heard, the auditory effect of the repetition of the phrase is what we want to point out. As storytelling, it sounds like this: and it happened that, and it happened that, and it happened that such and such. The narrative in Mark comes off as a collection of teaching parables that may not necessarily be following a chronological sequence. In Mark, Jesus as a teacher, the use of parables to teach, and the title Son of Man are all connected in that they have their source in Ezekiel. That Mark's use of egeneto is intended as such is corroborated by a second literary device that appears in the same verse 9. That expression, en ikinas tes imeras, in those days, is used in chapter 13 when Jesus is asked by Peter, James, and John and Andrew, kathidian, privately, when all these things, that is, the things surrounding the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, will be fulfilled. After warning them not to be deceived and describing at length all these things that must first take place but the end will not be yet, Jesus uses the expression in verse 24 to introduce the teaching on the coming of the Son of Man. But en ikinas tes imeras, in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. That's Mark 13, verses 24 to 27. We can say that in verse 9, Mark introduces Jesus as the coming one. He prepares his hearers at the first appearance of Jesus in the narrative for his coming as the Son of Man at the end. But for now, as Son of Man, like the members of the community of which he is the head, he must be thrown into the wilderness to be tested by the same Spirit that appeared when the voice of God declared him to be his Son. Note the swiftness with which Mark describes both the revelation by God of Jesus as his Son, his agapitos, his beloved, and the necessity of his being put under the test for 40 days, which links it to the 40 years in the wilderness of the first community, the children of Israel. The adverb evthis is translated by the ESV in two different ways here in Mark. Straightway in verse 9 and immediately in verse 12, but in Greek it is the same word. Interestingly, the rendering of this word in English as straightway connects it back to the adjective in verse 3, in which the Isaiah text says, "The ways of the Lord will be made evtheas," that is, straight. That it is the same Spirit that both accompanies the voice of God and also throws Jesus into the wilderness to be tested also calls to mind Ezekiel. The first mention in Ezekiel of many of ruach, that is, Spirit, is in chapter 1, verse 12, where the Spirit controls the movement of the four-faced, four-winged living creatures. And each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went without turning as they went. Notice that the creatures are said to go straight forward under direction and by the will of the Spirit. Moreover, in verse 7 of Ezekiel 1, the legs of the creatures are described as straight. In a similar way, in Mark, it is the Spirit of God that controls what Jesus, as the fulfillment of the servant Isaiah, does and where he goes. It is also the agent, via the proclamation of the gospel, that ensures that the paths of the Lord are made straight. In this, we see in Mark a direct parallel between the person of Jesus and the gospel itself, something which will be spelled out explicitly by Jesus himself later in chapter 8 and in chapter 10. And that's all for this episode of A Light to the Nations. I thank you for listening today, and I look forward to meeting you again next time.